The Nipper Medical Catalog is not a theory. It is a clay tablet. It sits in the University of Pennsylvania Museum. It was excavated in 1889 and has been translated 3 separate times. It lists 250 drugs, describes surgical instruments by name, and contains detailed instructions for a procedure involving the skull that would not be formally named by Western medicine until the 1870s CE. There is a 4,000-year gap between those 2 dates. Historians acknowledge the tablet exists. They do not acknowledge what that gap means. Nobody does. And I think that's worth looking at very closely. If this kind of history interests you, subscribing takes 2 seconds, and it means you won't miss what comes next, because this channel goes deep on exactly this kind of thing. In 1889, was a team of archaeologists working under the joint sponsorship of the University of Pennsylvania and the Babylonian Exploration Fund began digging through the ruins of Nippur, an ancient Sumerian city located in what is now south-central Iraq. Nippur was not a capital city. It was something more important than that. It was a religious and intellectual center, the home of the Temple of Enlil. And for thousands of years, it functioned as the cultural archive of the ancient Near East. The clay tablets they pulled out of the ground, their number in the tens of thousands, and they are still being studied today. Among those tablets was the document that would eventually be cataloged as the Nippur Medical Catalog. It was not the only medical text found at Nippur. There were others, but this one was different in scope and in specificity. Like when the first translation came in during the early 20th century, scholars noted its size, its organization, and the precision of its language. It was not a prayer, it was not a myth, it was a working document, the kind a physician would use. The first serious scholarly analysis was published in 1940 by Samuel Noah Kramer, one of the preeminent summerologists of the 20th century. Kramer spent decades working through the Nippur tablets, and he understood better than almost anyone what the medical texts were actually saying. His translations confirmed what the initial readings had suggested. This was a systematic medical reference, written by someone who knew what they were doing in a clinical sense, not a spiritual one. 2 subsequent retranslations, conducted independently decades apart, reached the same conclusion. What the tablet contains is striking in ways that are difficult to fully absorb without stopping and sitting with the numbers. 250 individual drug compounds are listed, organized by condition. The catalog specifies ingredients, preparation methods, and dosages. It distinguishes between internal and external applications. It references surgical instruments using technical terminology that required philologists to cross-reference against later Akkadian and Assyrian texts before they could be confident in the translations. And embedded within this catalog, described with the same clinical matter-of-factness as a recipe for a herbal poultice, is a procedure involving the human skull that should not exist in any document this old. The procedure described in the Nippur Medical Catalog is cranial trepanation. That is the term for the surgical removal of a section of the skull, performed while the patient is alive, in order to access or relieve pressure on the brain beneath it. The formal medical definition of trepanation as a named surgical procedure, with documented instruments, documented technique, and documented outcomes, was established in Western medicine in the 1870s. The tablet describing it in cuneiform clay dates to approximately 2100 BC. The description in the catalog is not vague. It does not gesture in the direction of something that might be interpreted as surgery, if you squint. It names the specific instrument used to create the opening, a tool that translates closely to what modern surgeons call a trephine, which is a circular, saw-like device designed to cut a precise disc of bone from the skull. It describes the preparation of the patient. It notes the placement of the incision. It provides instructions for aftercare of the wound. This is not allegory. It is a protocol. The precision of the language creates an interesting problem for anyone trying to dismiss the text. If the tablet contained only a vague reference to opening the head during illness, it would be easy to argue that this represented a spiritual ritual, or a misunderstood wound treatment, or simply a bad translation. But the specificity eliminates those explanations one by one. You cannot accidentally describe a trephine if you do not know what a trephine is. You cannot accidentally specify that the instrument must be rotated at a consistent pressure to avoid fracturing the surrounding bone if you are guessing. That instruction, in particular, now reflects a knowledge of how bone responds to mechanical stress that is based entirely on hands-on experience. The catalog also distinguishes between different conditions that might require the procedure. It does not present trepanation as a single-use intervention. It contextualizes it within a broader framework of diagnosis, where certain presentations of symptoms are matched to certain treatments. That is not the behavior of a text that stumbled onto something by accident. It is the behavior of a medical tradition that had been developing this knowledge long enough to systematize it. If you have made it this far into the video and you are not subscribed yet, this is a good moment to change that. There is more coming on the ancient world that you are genuinely not going to want to miss. The tablet alone would be remarkable enough. But there is a second line of evidence, and this one is physical rather than textual. Beginning in the late 19th and continuing through the 20th century, archaeological excavations across ancient Mesopotamia and surrounding regions recovered human skulls that contained something unexpected. Circular openings in the bone, clean-edged, clearly deliberate, with one feature that changes everything about how they must be interpreted: signs of healing. Bone grows in response to injury. When a skull is damaged and the person survives, the bone at the edges of the wound begins to regenerate. That regeneration leaves a visible mark. The skulls recovered from Sumerian-era burial sites contain trepanation openings, whose edges show exactly this kind of healed bone growth. These were not post-mortem procedures. These were not accidental injuries. These were surgical interventions that the patients survived long enough for their bones to begin healing around the wound, which typically requires weeks to months of survival after the procedure. A significant analysis of trepanned skulls from the ancient Near East, published in the Journal of the History of Medicine and Allied Sciences, found that survival rates in the archaeological record were considerably higher than historians had initially expected. The presence of healed bone was not rare. In several excavated collections, the majority of trepanned skulls showed evidence of post-surgical survival. That fact is impossible to square with the idea that ancient practitioners were experimenting blindly. Blind experimentation does not produce consistent survival. Consistent survival requires consistent technique, and consistent technique requires accumulated knowledge passed down with enough precision that each practitioner doing the procedure is doing essentially the same thing. What the skulls tell us, taken together with what the tablet describes, is that this was not a one-off occurrence. This was a medical practice that was being performed regularly enough to leave behind a physical trail in the burial record, and that was being performed with enough skill that patients were living through it. That changes the nature of the question considerably. Here is the problem, and it is a real problem, not a rhetorical one. And cranial trepanation as a formal medical procedure disappears from the documented record for approximately 4,000 years between the Sumerian sources and its re-emergence in modern Western medicine. That is not a minor gap in the literature. That is not a translation problem. That is an almost complete absence of evidence that the knowledge was transmitted, studied, or practiced in the way that knowledge of that complexity should be transmitted. If it originated where and when the standard historical model says it originated. There are isolated examples of trepanned skulls from other periods and regions, some from Iron Age Europe, some from pre-Columbian South America, some from ancient Egypt. But those examples are geographically scattered, temporally inconsistent, and they do not come with accompanying textual documentation of the kind the Nippur catalog represents. What exists in the archaeological record of the ancient Near East is a coherent medical tradition, documented in writing, confirmed by physical evidence, and then largely gone. Medieval European medicine did not practice systematic trepanation with atropine in the way the Nippur catalog describes. The surgical texts of the Islamic Golden Age touched on it, but without the procedural specificity of the Sumerian source. The major revival of interest in cranial surgery in the 1800s was treated in contemporary medical literature as a relatively new field of inquiry. The physicians who formalized trepanation in the 19th century did not describe themselves as rediscovering something ancient. They described themselves as pioneering something new. So the question is not whether the knowledge existed. The tablet exists. The skulls exist. The question is how a medical tradition sophisticated enough to produce a 250-drug catalog with detailed surgical protocols in a civilization that is by most accounts the first we formally recognize, arrived at this level of clinical understanding with no traceable precursor in the archaeological record. Every other major medical tradition we can document shows its development. We can watch Egyptian medicine get more complex over centuries. We can trace Greek medical thought from its early philosophical roots through to Galen. The Sumerian material does not show us its development. It shows us its results. That could mean the precedents are buried somewhere we have not yet excavated. A significant portion of the ancient Near East has never been archaeologically surveyed, and geopolitical instability across the region has made systematic excavation extremely difficult for decades. It is entirely possible that earlier tablets exist, which would show us the steps that led to the Nippur catalog. But it could also mean something that historians and archaeologists tend to be reluctant to state plainly, which is that we do not actually know where this knowledge came from. Acknowledging uncertainty is not the same as proposing an outlandish theory. It is the most honest thing you can say when the evidence genuinely does not add up. The Nippur medical catalog has been translated 3 times over roughly a century of scholarship. Each translation has confirmed the core content of the document, but the full catalog has not been comprehensively published in a form accessible to the general public, and not every tablet associated with the Nippur medical corpus has received the same level of scholarly attention. There are sections that have been noted, cataloged by subject, and then essentially set aside because the translation work is slow and funding for ancient language scholarship is not exactly abundant. What is in those sections is genuinely unknown to most people, including most historians who do not specialize in this area. The Nippur corpus contains texts related to obstetrics, ophthalmology, and what appears to be early dentistry. It contains pharmacological descriptions of compounds that modern chemists have not yet attempted to reconstruct or analyze. It contains surgical language that, even in its translated form, is still being debated in terms of what specific procedures it is actually describing. The trepanation record is the part of this story that is well enough documented to make a clean argument about. But it represents one procedure from one document in one of the largest collections of ancient writing ever excavated. If one procedure in that collection predates its Western medical equivalent by 4,000 years, it is worth asking how many others do. It is worth asking what else is on those tablets, and why it has taken this long to ask that question seriously. The tablet is in Philadelphia. The skulls are in museums across Iraq, Germany, and the United States. The translations are published and available. None of this is hidden. What has been missing is not the evidence. And what has been missing is the willingness to follow the evidence to the question it is actually raising. If you want to keep going on topics like this, subscribing is the best way to stay in the loop. And there are more videos waiting for you right now that go just as deep. Click on one and keep watching.